Good afternoon, good evening, or good night, and welcome to this video on, shall we say, the spirit of deconstruction. It occurred to me while watching certain online criticisms of certain media that there was, in a sense, a kind of deconstruction going on of the narratives involved in our current culture. I'll get to these videos later on, principally videos by a YouTuber ER and his take on works like Mad Max Fury Road and Star Wars, the Disney Star Wars. First, I'd like to read an excerpt from a work by Dostoevsky, Demons. In this work, Dostoevsky tells a story about, shall we say, modernist socialist youths terrorizing Russia, deconstructing all of the old traditions and trampling on all of the old taboos in order to bring about something new. But he opens with an excerpt from Pushkin, a novel by Pushkin of the same name, Demons. Strike me dead, can't see the way. It's lost we are, what can we do? Could be a demon's leading us through the fields, in circles, and we've gone astray. What's driving them? And such a band? What is their doleful song about? Laying a house sprite in the ground, giving in marriage a witch's hand? Dostoevsky is always a master of real human drama and investigation of human souls in that drama. Very faithfully captured, I think, the spirit of deconstruction that we see today. The characters involved in the work mentioned, Demons, went around gleefully deconstructing old norms and fubbing the rules, so to speak, and laughing and deriding authority, and seemed to do so for its own sake. There was a certain joy taken in the perceived pointlessness of life, and so free-for-all, that they were espousing. But they did so in a sort of rationalist principles. They seemed to have an idea of something that they could build up, but they never seemed very intent on actually doing it, and indeed it seemed as if near the end there was in fact nothing that they were building up, only things they were tearing down. I want to relate this spirit, and I may come back to the work later to sort of elaborate on what I think it is. I want to relate this spirit to the rise of internet critics in the early 2000s, in fact. Critics such as MENACE, Critic, Spoony, Angry Video Game Nerd. Not that these were the most egregious examples, but I see a sort of similar spirit in them.
By the mid-2000s, internet video media had grown in popularity both in terms of creation and viewership. Though consumer-grade video production tools were limited at the time, amateur producers would use their limited resources to create content centered around media, especially video games and movies. The most notable example was James Rolfe, later known as the Angry Video Game Nerd, who began creating videos in 2004, playing an exaggeratedly angry character delivering harsh criticism for bad and sometimes obscure games released on the NES. Internet users would be inspired by content such as that of James Rolfe, and soon, they too were creating reviews of media that they perceived as being mediocre or poor, which they would upload onto these more convenient services.
Star Wars The Phantom Menace was the most disappointing thing since my son.
I did not hit her. It's not true. It's bullshit. I did not hit her. I did not. Oh, hi, Mark. I did not hit her. It's not true.
No, don't play it again. I think the evidence is very clear. That is the worst piece of acting that has ever been put on film. I mean, my God! Not one inflection was right. Not one word was said correctly. Not one breath of air made me believe anything that he was saying.
There's a very short list of things so awful, so terrible, so catastrophically damaging to Earth, history, and culture that they're often used as the baseline for comparison for the most dreadful, foulest atrocities ever to blight the planet.
Yes, when the early 2000s rolled around, it seemed the time had come for everyone to wake up and laugh at the absurdities of the 70s, 80s, even the 60s, and the 90s, of course. The Arnold Schwarzenegger films, the experimental stuff. The saying was true, everyone became a critic. And the criticisms had a common element.
And I admit this is a minor point, but we can also hear a news report in McCloud's car that says one of the stupidest things I've ever heard in a movie since Brackett is no mad dog killer.
Today, the Shield Corporation, the world's largest private company, was accused of monopoly and price fixing.
Monopoly and price fixing? Really? You mean to tell me that Connor McCloud's Planetary Shield unfairly put all the other competing Planetary Shield corporations out of business? Of course he has a monopoly! He invented the Planetary Shield! The one shield surrounding the one planet! And price fixing's the one that kills me. What, the Shield Corporation is illegally charging too much for a service everyone needs to have to not burst into flames? What are they gonna do if you don't pay your bill? Turn the shield off?
For years, we've been thinking about what our kid would have been like. We could move on tomorrow, just for tonight. Can we have a kid?
You know, this might sound like a radical idea, but why not an orphanage? Yeah, a little weird seeing how the film opens up with them at the orphanage. So it's not like this never crossed their minds. If having a child meant so much to you, why didn't you just do that before?
After this encounter, Angelica goes back to Granny's room and explains how sad she is that she can't go to the reception with the guy she just met because she has nothing to wear. Upon hearing this, Granny offers Angelica her old dress from her youth, which she for some reason has with her on the ship.
I haven't worn this since my poor Francis took me to the opera for the first and last time.
Oh, Granny, how heartwarming. Wait, first and last. Granny, something you want to talk about? Is Uncle Francis, is he all right? Also, I don't want to know what happened in, around, or near that dress if Granny was so fond of that night. Yeah, I wouldn't do that, Angelica. Some Uncle Francis might still be on there, if you know what I'm saying.
I'm sure most of you will understand what I'm getting at this point. While it's true I don't want to put a blanket statement on these new kinds of critics, there were some that offered criticism more insightful and perhaps more in-depth, considering the art form they were criticizing. And with what appeared to be an idea of the better or the good, for the most part these new critics would simply find a flaw and hammer on it for comedic effect. Sort of deconstruction for fun, if you like. Now, this was enjoyable. Very, very entertaining, in fact. Especially if it was a form of media that I did not like, or something that had a message I didn't agree with, but more on that later. I think this style of criticism is also present in the subject of this video, a YouTuber called ER.
The Mad Max setting is retarded. It's a big deserty wasteland where water, food, and the essentials are scarce, but functioning cars and motorbikes are somehow plentiful. But it knows it's retarded and relishes in it. It's all rather kitsch, and it pulls that part off pretty spectacularly, so I won't be nitpicking any of that, at the very least. There's just so much wrong with this game that I don't even know where to start. Well, how about the characters? We have Mad Maxine, a very boyish-looking hipster from Arcadia Bay, Oregon. She's a photography student at an art boarding school, and her claim to fame are her selfies. Not even joking. She takes selfies. She's lauded for taking selfies.
Welcome to parenting in 2015. They're all just completely transfixed.
See, Eldon Tyrell wanted to assuage the rising emotional instability in the Nexus 6 models. Their 4-year lifespans were too short to come to terms with their burgeoning emotions, so Rachel was built and implanted with the memories of Tyrell's niece to make her believe she was human, which would act as a framework to cushion her own emotions. That was what Rachel was for. She was an experiment to resolve the Nexus 6 problem. But 2049 would have you believe that Tyrell went drastically further than that. He was lying to Deckard the whole time about simply gifting replicants the past. He went whole hog and created a successfully fertile replicant before he ever confirmed that Rachel would consider herself human, then paraded her around a Blade Runner so that he'd fuck her and create a brand new form of life. That's pretty twisted, even for Tyrell. First of all, he based Rachel off of his niece. 2049 is telling you that Tyrell replicated his niece so that she could be impregnated by another man. He was a weirdo, that Tyrell, but don't think he was supposed to be into pseudo-incestual cuckoldry. Second of all, if Rachel had the 4-year limitation, she couldn't be a mother to her own child. 2049 definitely dodges this, maybe she does, maybe she doesn't, by killing her in childbirth. Kinda smart, but also kinda deceptive, you sly dog. Even if Tyrell fervently wanted to see his niece knocked up, and even if Rachel had an open-ended lifespan, it's all still a little f***ing rushed, don't you think? Can a replicant not know it's a replicant? Let's find out. Wait. Can a replicant replicate? I should probably put that aside until I get the simulated humanity thing down, but now let's do both right f***ing now.
Okay, how is the style similar? The style is similar because it's looking for sort of logical real-world inconsistencies in narratives, and using that to tear the narrative apart. It's a strange kind of deconstruction because it seems to rely implicitly on a sort of objective, real-world, Western-style philosophy, I think. But that's not really the point of this video. The point of this video isn't a critique of ER's critique, or really even a comparison. It's about, as I said, the spirit of deconstruction, which you can see in these critics, in ER himself. For example, when he takes on Mad Max, exposes the underlying narratives, not so subtly hidden feminist narratives in Mad Max, Star Wars, social justice narratives in Legend of Korra, Steven Universe. He has fun, and his audience has fun, I have fun, in the deconstruction of these narratives, because, fundamentally, I disagree with them, and I enjoy seeing them torn down. And that is the spirit of deconstruction that I think is common to all of these. These cultural narratives that ER combats, their proponents take them very seriously. Increasingly seriously, in fact. Almost to a religious fervor. They're very pious that way. These narratives begin to take on a sort of cultural meta-narrative form, especially in the recent years. And that cultural meta-narrative, these new social justice narratives have replaced the old cultural meta-narratives, as the old cultural meta-narratives have increasingly been deconstructed themselves. These new ones are not quite as solid, nearly as durable as the old ones, so deconstructing them is easy enough, and fun in many ways. It's interesting to think about the franchises that these new cultural narratives have chosen as, what should we call, vessels or mediums for their message. They're all older franchises. Ghostbusters, Star Wars, Marvel Comics. It's as if they can't create something new for themselves, so they have to take the old vessels and change the content that's already there to a point where it carries its message instead of the old one. And how hard is that? Not very hard. That's part of what makes these new narratives so weak and easy to destroy and deconstruct. Their lack of creativity, of originality. betrays their shallowness.
And this is something that I think even in modern entertainment, this is something, this is what boomer culture had that millennial culture doesn't have. And this is what kind of leads to what Mark Fisher talks about in his capitalist realism concept, is that when you go back to the original 1980s properties like Star Wars and Ghostbusters and Back to the Future, these were pop culture phenomenons. They were somewhat humorous, but they were entirely sincere. Whereas their modern remake iterations, they're constantly sarcastic. And even the people who defend them, even the people who defend the Star Wars sequels, a few moments aside, and the moments that they do defend as sincere are explicit flatterings of their political preconceptions, a few moments aside like that, they embrace them in this weird kind of sarcastic, ironic sense. It's hard to really explain.
There is something about ER that feels a bit like low-hanging fruit, or at least the targets he chooses. I know this is probably seeming a lot like a targeted criticism of ER himself, but I would find it hard to criticize ER. I find him funny because he takes down all the narratives I dislike the most. Something seems quite easy about it, and at the same time there's something kind of tragic about laughing at these people. They do seem to be the fruit of the generation that deconstructed the old narratives in order to find something new, and they haven't found anything new, so they've had to divvy up some wretched mess of an ideology, whatever you want to call it, intersectionality, third/fourth wave feminism, multiculturalism, diversity, inclusivity, equity, and use that as a sort of flimsy raft to keep themselves afloat after they deconstructed the ship. And so to tear apart the raft from these desperate people seems in some way unkind, even though it might be just, considering the thing they've thrown away. The idea of postmodern deconstruction was a total emancipation. The faith, the belief was, if all structure, if all restraint, constraint, culture was taken away, was removed, and man was completely emancipated, there would be this wonderful freedom.
Deconstruction is, as a thought process, precisely a kind of evasive dance whereby one doesn't settle for distinct positions, for any sort of idea that can be understood as governed, and this is what structure, sign, and play is all about, that can be understood as governed by a blanket term, what Derrida often calls a transcendental signified. We'll have much more to say about this. But Derrida's prose style, its kind of crab-like sideways movement around an argument, is meant as rigorously as it can to avoid seeming to derive itself from some definite concept. Because, of course, deconstruction is precisely the deconstruction of the grounds whereby we suppose our thinking can be derived from one or another definite concept.
That the point of being postmodern or being avant-garde or whatever wasn't to follow in a certain kind of tradition, that all that stuff is BS imposed by critics and camp followers afterwards, that what the really great artists do, and it sounds very trite to say it out loud, well, what the really great artists do is they're entirely themselves. They're entirely themselves. They've got their own vision, their own way of fracturing reality, and that if it's authentic and true, you will feel it in your nerve endings.
Well, I can see why people found it attractive. The night and the dream were long, but when we woke up, we discovered there was really nothing to it. Clive Hamilton, in his work Freedom Paradox Towards a Post-Secular Ethics, characterized it thus. Yet the weakness of social constructionism is now laid bare. For all its radical challenge to accepted authority, it never knew what it wanted. Latour, a French philosopher and sociologist, asks, what were we really after? when we were so intent on showing the social construction of scientific facts? And answers that, although some went too far and created an excessive distrust of good matters of fact, the aim really was to emancipate the public from prematurely naturalized objective facts. And then what? This only displaces the answer. For how do we know when the facts have matured sufficiently for us to trust them? What was the purpose of postmodernism? What was to replace the structure that the critique tore down so ruthlessly? There was no vision.
These lesbians here, these lesbians, they're not women. They're not lesbians either. They're strong, independent gems, okay? Not women. And I mean, everybody loves the portrayal of women and how there's finally queer representation for the mentally ill, but they're not gems. I mean, they're not lesbians. They're gems. They're non-lesbian, non-women who are into chicks, but they're not women. He also locks up beautiful women in a vault to use as breeders. Bam! The final nail in the coffin. Mistreating women, children, or puppies is a flat-out no-no.
Plot devices that capitalize on female trauma for shock value function in much the same way as the hitting a child or kicking the dog tropes do.
Mein Führer, Steiner konnte nicht genügend Kräfte für einen Angriff massieren. Der Angriff Steiner ist nicht erfolgt.
Das war ein Befehl! Der Angriff Steiner war Befehl! Wer schickt sie?
The boomers who deconstructed the old Western morality were tearing down something real, something with foundations, something that made sense, something that had lasted through the generations. I can imagine it must have felt important, it must have felt weighty, must have given a certain amount of gravitas to their work, to their actions, imbued their actions in their mind with a certain amount of meaning. In comparison, this feels shallow. All it takes, you can tell by the reactions that it's so sensitive that all it takes is laughter to tear it down. It's so easy, it's so fragile. And so what's even the point in laughing at it? It seems in some way uncharitable, as if it were like removing the logs that these people were using to stay afloat, that they're desperately clinging to. What I am critiquing here is not ER, but my reaction to him. I noticed in my reaction a certain kind of glee. To find enjoyment in other people's discomfort or anxiety, no matter who they are or what they've done, and believe me, I know what some of these people have done, is wrong. But I'm not here to condemn ER. He was pointing out faults in narratives, I was only laughing. Laughing at destruction. Laughing at deconstruction. Laughing to spite the others who are struggling to stay afloat. Maybe.